The Book of Genesis by Robert S. Candlish. 16. Victory over the invaders of the land. Interview with Melchizedek. Genesis chapter 14. Quote, "He teacheth my hands to war," end quote. Psalm 18, verse 34. Quote, "The less is blessed of the better," end quote. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 7. This 14th chapter has the air and aspect of an episode in the history. It stands out, singular and unique. The warlike character which Abram assumes is a solitary exception to the usual tenor of his life, and his subsequent interview with the royal priest is altogether peculiar. 1. Abram, for the most part a man of peace, quietly sojourning as a stranger in the land, suddenly appears at the head of an army, and signalizes his martial powers in the battlefield. 1. The occasion of his taking arms is the danger of his kinsman Lot. That righteous man, though he has imprudently involved himself in too close a connection with the wicked, is still reckoned as forming part of the household of faith, and while in this instance he pays dear for that selfish covetousness or reckless inadvertence which had tempted him to associate with men of the world, he experiences also the seasonable benefit of having a man of God as his friend. It would seem that before this time the land of the Canaanites had been the scene of conquests and revolutions. In particular, the remarkable fertility of the plain of the Jordan, or, quote, the Vale of Siddim, end quote, together with the growing wealth of the cities in the neighborhood, made that portion of the country more especially liable to the scourge of war. Accordingly, it had attracted the cupidity of a foreign invader, who for a considerable time held undisputed sway over its petty princes. Quote, 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, end quote, verses 3 and 4. Who this Chedorlaomer was must now be almost entirely a matter of conjecture. It is in the briefest and slightest possible way, and only in so far as it incidentally touches his main subject, that the inspired writer notices the contemporary history of the Gentile world. In the present instance, however, something may be fairly gathered from the description given to the potentate in question. He is described as king of Elam, and Elam is the scriptural name of Persia, or at least it may here denote that part of Persia which was known in ancient history by the name of Elymas. At this period, probably, a Persian dynasty had arisen in the race of Elam, who was one of the sons of Shem, Genesis chapter 10, verse 22. And some have even thought that they could identify this Chedorlaomer with one or other of the early Persian kings, of whom a list is given in certain ancient annals. That he was a conqueror, aiming at extensive empire, is very plain, and he seems also to have obtained an ascendancy over the oldest and most powerful monarchies of the East. Among his three allies we find Amraphel, king of Shinar, which is the Babylonian plain, Genesis chapter 10 verse 10 and chapter 11 verse 2, evidently the head, at this time, of the Assyrian kingdom founded by Nimrod. Where the other two reigned is quite uncertain. Elasar, the country of which Arioch was king, is believed by some to be Syria, and Tidal, king of nations, is supposed to have been either the ruler over a few petty tribes or the captain of a roving band composed of recruits from various countries. Of the four, Chedorlaomer plainly takes the lead on this occasion, and the expedition is mainly his. It was by him that this portion of Canaan had been subdued 12 years before, and to him it had continued subject all that time, its inhabitants paying him tribute, and their native princes acknowledging his supremacy and ruling as his deputies. Impatient, however, of a foreign yoke, they found occasion, in the 13th year, to rebel, and as in these days an extensive empire could be but little consolidated, and the power of a conqueror over a remote province must have been very precarious, they succeeded in regaining their independence, verse 4. But the very next year, verse 5, Chedorlaomer with his allies undertook a new expedition into Canaan, and after making a rapid circuit, sweeping along the very verge of the wilderness, so as to subdue the surrounding nations from whom the rebels might have looked for help, he came down with his victorious troops upon the devoted cities of the plain, prepared to dart upon his prey, and eager to avenge the revolt of this refractory portion of his dominions. Verses 5 to 9. It may be presumed that the state of luxury and extreme dissoluteness of manners into which they had fallen but ill-fitted the effeminate inhabitants for resisting the army before which their neighbours had fallen. The kings of the 5 principal cities did, indeed, muster their forces, but in a pitched battle with the 4 invading princes they sustained a total defeat. Verses 8 to 10. The nature of the country, full of slime pits, dug for the supply of pitch or mortar for building, rendered retreat difficult, so that nearly the whole of the vanquished were cut off, a few only escaping to the mountains. Thus the cities were left defenceless, and fell an easy prey to the conquerors. Accordingly, having satiated their lust for plunder by the spoiling of the houses, they departed, carrying with them goods and victuals, as well as the women and others of the inhabitants. Verses 11 and 16. In this calamity Lot and his household shared. It does not appear that he was personally implicated, either in the revolt which provoked the vengeance of Chedorlaomer, or in the battle which ended so fatally for the native kings. But the disastrous issue of the contest affected him as well as the rest. The enemy made no distinctions. They had no respect of persons. They treated him with no ceremony, nor did they at all regard his character or his privileges, whether as a stranger or as a magistrate. Still less did they stand in awe of his high calling, as a servant of the true God, and a man righteous in his generation. Why indeed should they? What did they know of his righteousness? Or what did they care for it? They found him among those who had rebelled against them, and that was enough for them. So it will most commonly happen when a man of God, for worldly ends, joins affinity or makes alliances with the ungodly. Those with whom he immediately connects himself may at first seem to spare him, having some advantage to gain by his countenance or his help, and feeling that his presence among them is a kind of shelter to themselves. They may show him some deference, and exempt him from the necessity of cooperating in some of their most indefensible schemes. But he is in a false and suspicious position, and he cannot long escape. In the eyes of indifferent spectators, still more in the eyes of inveterate opponents, he is confounded indiscriminately with his associates. Their enemies become his, and searching out the faults, and resenting the injuries, of those with whom he keeps company, they involve him alike in the blame and in the revenge. Nor can he with any decency complain. He suffers but what he might expect. Finding him among the rebels, will the conquerors be apt to hear or to believe that he is innocent of the rebellion? Having been so unjust to himself, can he look for justice from them? 2. Such is the occasion on which Abram takes arms. But that he does so on the mere impulse of natural affection, however amiable, we can scarcely believe. He surely has divine warrant for what he does. He fights once, as he walks always, by faith. If it be to this affair that Isaiah refers, Isaiah chapter 41, verses 2 and 3, his testimony is explicit as to the divine sanction given to Abram's enterprise. And even if the application of that passage in Isaiah be doubtful, we may safely judge that Abram would not have resolved beforehand on so unusual a step, and would not have received so remarkable a blessing afterwards, if it had been simply his own feelings, and not the express will of God, that he was obeying. For what right had Abram to wage this war? And what power had he to wage it successfully? Neither the right nor the power belonged to him naturally. Both were of faith. Both the right and the power flowed from him in whom he believed. Thus, as to the right, what is Abram, viewing his position with the eye of sense, and apart from his peculiar character as the friend of God and the heir of the promise? He is merely a private individual, and a stranger too, in the land. Wealthy, indeed, but invested with no public or official authority. What title has he to levy arms? His kinsman's capture may be very grievous and offensive to him. He may be moved with compassion and stirred up to anger. But is he at liberty, on that account, to put himself at the head of an army of his own, and to act as an independent captain or prince? Besides, even if he should be so inclined, what power has he to give him any chance of success? What forces can he lead into the field? The males of his own household, 318 men, hastily prepared and armed, For though 3 confederates are mentioned, verses 13 and 24, it does not appear that they furnished any men for this enterprise. And with these he is to pursue a numerous army, flushed with victory, and headed by 4 valiant monarchs. The exploit of Gideon was scarcely to all outward appearance more desperate. But Abram believed, and in faith he went forth to battle. It is the promise of God which gives him both the right and the power. It is as the lord of the country, made so by the promise of God. It is as the real owner and legitimate ruler of it, that Abram, on this occasion, exercises the royal prerogative of making war. This one passing glimpse God saw fit to give of the true character of him who, to the eye of sense, seemed to be nothing more than a private man, a pilgrim and sojourner, comparatively obscure and unknown. Just as in the days of the Saviour's humiliation, it pleased the Father to show him once in the glory in which he is at last to reign. And as then, on the Mount of Transfiguration, there were 3 companions, eyewitnesses of Christ's glory, so it would almost seem as if the same number were purposely selected to be with Abram on the occasion of this unwanted manifestation of his high dignity. We read of 3 men, whether independent princes or merely influential neighbours does not appear, though the last seems more probable, who were confederate with Abram, who cultivated his friendship, and were disposed to make common cause with him, recognizing in him something more than met the eye, some mark of his actual position as blessed, and made heir of the land by God. For that there were a few among those with whom the patriarch met, who had some idea of what he really was, and of what he had a right to be, this very chapter testifies, in the instance of Melchizedek. Possibly also the messenger who brought Abram tidings of Lot's calamity may have been one of these. Quote, "There came one that had escaped, and told Abram the Hebrew," end quote, verse 13. The message is brought to, quote, Abram the Hebrew, end quote, a title which some have interpreted as referring merely to the patriarch's having come from beyond the river Euphrates, but which it is far more natural to understand as denoting his descent from Heber or Eber. We have already seen that Eber was specially distinguished in the line of Shem, Genesis chapter 10, verse 21, and that very probably it was he who was commissioned to announce that authoritative division of the earth from which his son, Peleg, received his name. Eber, therefore, might well be held in remembrance in these early times, and it could scarcely fail to be known that, in the division of the earth, this particular portion had been reserved for his seed. Accordingly, when Abram appeared in Canaan, to distinguish him as the Hebrew, or the descendant of Eber, might fairly imply an acknowledgment of his high hereditary claims, and such an acknowledgment he might naturally receive from those who duly marked the ways of the Lord in regard to him. Hence the propriety of his being saluted in this connection as, quote, Abram the Hebrew, end quote. If he was to come forward in the matter at all, as the messenger seemed to suggest, and as his 3 friends were prepared to expect, it must be in the character indicated by this patronymic title, or name of descent. If they thought it natural or reasonable that he should interfere, it must have been because they discerned his right to that character and that title, a right not only founded on his descent from Eber, but confirmed by special promises given to himself. Otherwise, indeed, the idea of his acting as a prince and leading an army would scarcely have occurred, either to them or to himself. He is justified in what he does by his consciousness. They are reconciled to it by their perception of his true rank and final destiny. For once, in his pilgrim state, God glorifies his servant before the eyes of all as the proprietor and lord of the land. Not, therefore, as a private person, not as a stranger and pilgrim, which character he usually bore, but as the heir, did Abram on this occasion take the sword and wage war against the invaders of the kingdom which was his own. And thus for himself he received, and to all who had a spiritual discernment he gave, a pledge and earnest of things to come. It was an anticipation of the promise, even as the transfiguration of Christ was a foretaste or foreshadowing of the reward set before him, and the glory to be revealed in him. 3. Thus Abram for a brief space appears as a warrior prince and a conqueror. As a warrior, how just and generous is the cause of conflict. As a conqueror, how noble and disinterested is his use of victory. To rescue a lost kinsman is his single aim, a kinsman too, deserving of no such kindness at his hands. The separation which had taken place, not, as it would seem, very reluctantly on the side of Lot, his selfish choice of the fairest portion of the land, his rashly formed connection with the wicked for the sake of gain, and his consequent distance and estrangement from his best and truest friend, these things might almost have justified Abram in leaving him to his fate. But all past unkindness is forgotten, in pity for his present woeful plight. Abram makes haste to help him, nor does he fear, on his behalf, to encounter with a mere handful a mighty host. Such was the end of this war on the part of Abram, the deliverance of one of his own kinsmen and brethren out of the hands of the invading foe. That the men of Sodom shared for a season in the benefit of that deliverance was an incidental consequence, not the main and primary purpose of his interposition. In rescuing Lot, he rescued also, quote, their goods and women and people, end quote, verse 16. In their case, however, it was but a temporary respite that was thus procured for them. They only perished the more miserably at the last. Nor was it for their sakes that Abram interfered. Whatever temporary advantage flowed to them was, as it were, by the way. The salvation of Lot was all that he sought. In all this, who can fail to see a typical representation of the warfare of Christ himself? He comes to bruise the serpent's head, to destroy the works of the devil, to spoil principalities and powers, to bind the strong man armed. One result of his interposition is the respite granted to the impenitent and unbelieving, who are rescued from immediate destruction and spared for a time on the earth. But alas, it is only, like the men of these doomed cities of the plain, to, quote, treasure up unto themselves wrath against the day of wrath, and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, end quote. Christ, however, has a people of his own, whose deliverance is the real end of his enterprise. For their sakes he came single-handed to encounter the foe, whose name is Legion. For their sakes he will not desist till, having followed up his conquest to the uttermost, he subdues even the last enemy, which is death. Like Abram, he loves and will deliver those whom, in the face of ingratitude and estrangement, quote, having loved from the first, he loves to the last, end quote, as his own. As the cause of war was just and generous, so the use which Abram made of victory was worthy of himself. Returning from this great exploit, he becomes at once a man of renown. He has acquired a name and power which nothing in the land can resist. Great kings have fled before him and have been destroyed. To the farthest corner of the land, even to Dan, he has pursued them with his little army of 318 men. Nay, beyond the borders of the land, he has penetrated even into Syria, to the neighborhood of Damascus itself, verse 15, and he has struck a blow in which, although he does avail himself of the arts of war, having recourse to a night attack, made simultaneously at different points, verse 15, still considering his comparatively feeble force, the hand of God is conspicuously apparent. Thus powerful and mighty in battle, why may he not instantly take possession of the land? It is at his feet. Why may he not occupy its throne? Surely it is because he believes God. He is not impatient or ambitious. He seeks not an earthly, but a heavenly country. Having accomplished the single purpose for which he took this unusual step, and having on that one occasion asserted and manifested his true character as Lord and heir of the land, he at once becomes a private man again. He is a stranger and pilgrim once more. So scrupulous indeed is he, in his care to avoid the suspicion of a selfish or interested aim, that he refuses all share of the spoil. His companions, the 3 friends who accompanied him, he will not defraud of their portions. But for himself he will take nothing, nor will he suffer his young men to receive any recompense beyond the food they have eaten. Least of all will he consent to receive hire from the king of Sodom, as though he were taking wages for the restoration of the persons or souls, by making the goods his own. Quote, I have lifted up, end quote, he says, quote, my hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich, save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their portion, end quote, verses 22 to 24. Nor is it in the mere affectation of a romantic and chivalrous independence that Abram thus rejects the king's well-meant proposal. His resolution had been formed before he undertook the expedition, and specially under the eye of him by whose authority he undertook it. From first to last, the whole is of God and unto God alone. He is not the mercenary captain of a free company, to lend out his services to whoever will pay for them. It is as the independent head of a great nation, and the real owner of this whole territory, that he lays aside, as it were, for a few days, his disguise, or his incognito, and vindicates the title which belongs to him, as the heir of the divine promises, to the praise of the glory of divine sovereignty and grace. Such is this memorable expedition. In its main and leading aspect, the leading of war or the taking up of arms, the conduct of Abram here is not a precedent for us. Still, in its accompanying features, this history is exemplary in a high degree. The brotherly kindness of the patriarch, his disinterestedness, and his heavenly mindedness are exhibited in this transaction for a pattern to us. Whatever power we have, let it be used for our brother's deliverance, for doing good to all, especially to such as are of the household of faith. Let all suspicion of covetousness or of selfish ends be carefully excluded in all our undertakings, and in the height of earthly triumph, let it be seen that we can forego the tempting prize, and live still as strangers and pilgrims, seeking a better, that is, a heavenly country. But it is chiefly in a spiritual and prophetical light that the affair is to be viewed. Spiritually, it may well be held to represent the victory of the Lord Jesus, and his triumph over principalities and powers in his cross. He then rescued the captives of Satan, and recovered the prey from the mighty, as his atoning blood shed for the remission of sins has satisfied divine justice, and opened the way to the Father, so, quote, through his death he hath destroyed him that had the power of death, that is, the devil, and delivered those who, through fear of death, were all their lifetime subject to bondage, end quote. Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. His people, therefore, are no longer under any necessity of making terms of precarious peace or compromise with, quote, the father of lies, end quote, and, quote, accuser of the brethren, end quote. Nor have they to wage with the, quote, prince of this world, end quote, an unequal warfare, in which they are sure to be discomfited. Satan has lost his advantage over them, and, being no longer at his mercy, but standing on a firm footing in the free favour and almighty strength of their God, they may defy his malice, and make good their escape from his toils. But let none presume upon the victory which Christ has gained, as giving them warrant to live at ease. How many of those who were indirectly partakers in the fruits of Abraham's triumph, abusing the respite granted to them, perished miserably in the avenging fire which destroyed the cities of the plain. Let the impenitent and unbelieving, who continue in sin because grace abounds, beware lest, in the end, a worse thing come upon them. And let his own people be careful to improve the victory which Christ has gained on their behalf, to stand fast in the liberty with which he has made them free, and not again be entangled in any yoke of bondage. Let them not sleep, as do others, while the fire is kindling which is to consume the wicked, but let them watch and be sober. Again, viewed prophetically, this incident presents to us the father of the faithful most vividly apprehending things to come. While as yet he has not a foot of ground that he can call his own, he assumes with all the calmness of undoubted sovereignty the right to act as the heir of the land. For a brief space, he exercises the functions of its lawful owner and ruler, thus truly living by the power of the world to come. It is a pledge of the glory to be revealed which is here given, a passing glimpse of the scene which is to be realized when the promise made to Abram shall be fully accomplished, and he shall be put in possession of his long-deferred inheritance. Like the heavenly brightness which overwhelmed the 3 apostles on the Mount of Transfiguration, this unwonted adventure in the lowly life of the pilgrim points to another order of things, and serves to give substance and evidence to what is still hoped for and unseen. We do not therefore follow cunningly devised fables when we anticipate the, quote, power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, end quote, and of his saints with him. We are here, as it were, made, quote, eyewitnesses, end quote, of the coming, quote, majesty, end quote, of both. And we have the surer word of prophecy. unfolding to us the prospect of, quote, many coming from the east and west to sit down forever with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, end quote. 2. The interview with Melchizedek throws additional light on the faith of Abram. The endless questions which have been discussed respecting Melchizedek's person, as well as the fancies of some of the early Christian fathers respecting the bread and wine, may be left altogether unnoticed. They have all arisen out of the vague impression which the Epistle to the Hebrews gives of there being a kind of mystery about the man. And so there is, in the scriptural sense of the word, mystery. There is a spiritual and figurative meaning in his history. He is a typical personage. But the evil is that the mystery has been supposed to lie in particulars where Paul gives no hint of it, as in the mere personal identity of Melchizedek, or in his selection of bread and wine as a refreshment for Abram. The whole real mystery of Melchizedek, the commentator himself clears up. It lies not in his person at all, but exclusively in his office. It is as a priest and prince that he is a mysterious, or rather simply a typical, personage. And he is so, chiefly in respect of these two particulars. First, the significant appellations which he bears as king, Hebrews chapter 7, verse 2, and, secondly, the singular and isolated order of his priesthood, Hebrews chapter 7, verse 3. As king, he bore the personal appellation of Melchizedek, or, quote, King of righteousness, end quote, and the seat of his kingdom being Salem, he held the title of, quote, King of Salem, end quote, which means King of Peace. Whether this Salem was the city which afterwards became Jerusalem, or some other place nearer the Vale of Siddim and the river of Jordan, John chapter 3, verse 23, does not appear, nor, indeed, is it the precise locality, but the name that is important. It was the King of righteousness and peace that Abram acknowledged in the very height of his own triumph, when he accepted Melchizedek's hospitality and received at his hands the refreshment of bread and wine. Again, as priest, Melchizedek stood apart from all other priests, isolated and alone, and Abram availed himself of his sacred offices in that character. Melchizedek, accordingly, on the one hand, blessed Abram on God's behalf, quote, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, end quote, verse 19. And again, on the other hand, he blessed God on Abram's behalf, quote, And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hands, end quote, verse 20. This brief and comprehensive form of benediction is, in truth, a summary of the entire priestly function, and it brings out, as comprised in one single and simple act, the whole ministry proper to the priest, as interposing or mediating between the great God in heaven and the servant or worshipper of God on earth. What is a priest but one through whose effectual offerings and intercession the blessing of God comes down upon man, and through whom, again, from man's deliverance, blessing and honour and glory and power redound to God, quote, in the highest. In a very inferior and subordinate sense, men may bless one another, and may bless God on behalf of one another. But in the one case, it is merely the utterance of a desire or prayer, and in the other, a becoming expression of reverence and gratitude. But the act of Melchizedek evidently implies something more. It is authoritative and efficacious. He blesses as one having the right to bless, as one whose ministry really and actually does bring good to man, on the one hand, and praise to God on the other. What good does it bring to man? Is it not all the fullness of God? What praise does it bring to God? Is it not all the praise of man's salvation? How marvellous, how full of meaning is this alternation or reciprocation, this intercommunion between God and man, of which the priest becomes the minister. Between the two parties, a transference or blessed exchange takes place, the highest property of each being imparted or ascribed to the other. For who, in this case, are the parties? God, on the one side, quote, the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, end quote, and Abram, on the other, saved in battle and victorious over all his enemies. And what is this double blessing? What does it imply? What but this, that the Lord's prerogative, as possessor of heaven and earth, becomes virtually Abram's, and Abram's glory, as victorious over all his enemies, becomes truly the Lord's. Oh, most blessed traffic, most profitable exchange! Who can hesitate about closing with so advantageous a treaty? Abram has the benefit of God being the possessor of heaven and earth. God has the glory of Abram's victory over his enemies. How gracious the arrangement! How reasonable, equitable, and righteous! What can faithful Abram say to it? Can he demur to the terms proposed, holding fast the praise of his victory as his own, and saying, "My own right hand has got it"? Can he be for taking the credit of it to himself, and reckoning on the like success as always at his command? That would be a miserable policy, poor economy indeed. Better far, even in a prudential point of view, to give it all over to God, and to receive instead of it a vested interest, if one may venture so to speak, a right of property in God himself, the Lord, Jehovah, as, quote, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, end quote. Besides thus blessing Abram, Melchizedek received tithes at his hand, quote, tithes of all, end quote, verse 20. Whether tithes of all the spoil of his enemies, or tithes of all his own property, is not said. Probably it was the tenth of both. How the custom of paying tithes originated, and by what authority it was sanctioned in these early days, we stay not now to inquire. One thing, however, may be clearly gathered from the traces which we find of this usage, whether in the Bible or in other ancient writings, that it was intimately associated with the institution of the priesthood and the offering of sacrifices. In his character of mediator, the priest received tithes. He received them as the pledge and token of the whole of what was tithed being the Lord's, of its belonging to God, and being freely dedicated and consecrated to him. For as the ordained and appointed medium or channel of communication between God and man, the priest not merely conveyed the gift of God to man, but conveyed also man's gifts to God. The blessing bestowed on the part of God passed through his hands, and so also did the offices and services rendered on the part of man. Such is the priestly function, as discharged by Melchizedek and acknowledged by Abram. But who or what is this Melchizedek, that he should be competent for such a function? He is, it is true, a king and priest together, but so were many heads of families and tribes in those days, and so virtually was Abram himself. Abram officiated as a priest when he built an altar, wherever he went, to the Lord, and on this one occasion, at least, the occasion on which he came in contact with Melchizedek, he acted as a king, going forth to battle and returning in triumph. In this respect, therefore, and insofar as the mere union of the two dignities of royalty and priesthood in one person was concerned, there was nothing very peculiar in Melchizedek's position. Abram himself stood almost on the same footing. What, then, does this transaction mean? 1. Melchizedek was undoubtedly an eminently holy man, a believer in the true God and in the promised Messiah, and accordingly the interview between him and Abram, considered merely as the meeting of two heaven-owned saints and patriarchs, is full of interest. The one is a remarkable example of the grace of God, preserving, amid the dregs of a general apostasy, an elect remnant. The other is an instance no less striking of that divine and sovereign grace bringing in, from without, a new seed. And the two, meeting thus as debtors to the same grace, cannot but rejoice in mutually recognizing and acknowledging each other. It is as if the torch were here visibly handed over from the last of the former band to the first of that which is to succeed. The church is transferred to a new stock or stem. The cause receives a new impulse, and is to have a fresh start. And this singular transaction between Melchizedek and Abram is the connecting link between the two systems, or orders, or dispensations, of which the one is now waxing old, and the other is but just beginning to appear. The general and unrestricted dispensation of religious faith and worship, transmitted indiscriminately by tradition among all the descendants of Noah, is about to give place to a dispensation limited to a particular family or race, to whom ultimately are to be committed the oracles of God. One form of the primitive order is to be superseded by another. The patriarchal institute is to be succeeded by the Levitical and legal ordinances which are to be established in Abram's house. And the substantial identity of the two, the patriarchal and the Levitical, is indicated by the meeting of their respective representatives. It is like aged Simeon, embracing in his arms the infant Saviour, the last patriarch and prophet of the Lord, not departing till he sees and hails the newborn hope of the gospel, the lingering twilight of declining day mingling with the dawn of a better morn. 2. But a higher view still is to be taken of this transaction. This is plain from the use which the apostle makes of it, and the importance which he attaches to it. Hebrews chapter 7. Melchizedek officiated as the type of the Messiah, who was to be a priest after the same order with himself, and Abram undoubtedly had respect to him in that character. It was not the mediation of a mere man that he acknowledged. It was not the ministry of an earthly priest in which he trusted. Melchizedek, king and priest as he was, could not really and effectually convey to Abram the blessing of the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and of earth. Nor was it through him that the glory of Abram's victory and the tithes of his spoil and of his goods could be acceptably transmitted to God. But a greater than Melchizedek is here, present, surely, not indeed to the senses, but to the minds of both. In his name Melchizedek acts, and to him, in Melchizedek's person, Abram does homage. The two patriarchs understand one another. Melchizedek, as the last preserver, as it were, of the primitive patriarchal hope, hands over his function to one more highly favoured than himself, in the very spirit of the Baptist. Quote, "He must increase, but I must decrease." End quote. John chapter 3, verse 30. His own occupation, as a witness and standing type of the Messiah, is over. One newly called out of heathenism is to succeed and to take his place. Melchizedek is content. He hails in Abram the promised seed, and blesses him accordingly, while again, in Melchizedek, Abram sees, however dimly, the day of Christ, and Christ himself. Thus the patriarchal, the Abrahamic, and the Levitical dispensations appear, all of them, in their true character, as subordinate and shadowy, and in the eye of faith Christ is all in all. 3. Let it be noted also that it is especially in contrast with the Levitical priesthood in the house of Aaron that the apostle exalts and magnifies the priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. His object is to satisfy the Hebrew Christians as to the reality of Christ's priesthood, and to instruct them as to its nature. For this purpose he cites the deed or decree of nomination or appointment. Quote, "Jehovah hath sworn, and will not repent. Thou art a priest for ever after the order of Melchizedek." End quote. Psalm 110, verse 4, appealing to this irrevocable oath as the warrant for regarding the Messiah as invested in perpetuity with the priestly office. Hebrews chapter 7. Nor could exception be taken to his being held to be a priest because he was not of the house of Aaron. This might have been an insuperable bar to his claim, had he sought to minister in the earthly sanctuary and to be the mediator of the Levitical covenant. But as our forerunner, he has entered for us within the veil, into the true sanctuary, the heavenly place itself, and his ministry is connected with another dispensation altogether, and with another covenant. Neither, again, could it be objected that this was an afterthought, a theory devised by the followers of Jesus to serve a purpose and make the old scriptures tally with the new faith of a crucified Messiah. For the very character of the Messiah's priesthood, from the first announcement of it, the very word of the oath by which it was solemnly declared that he was to be a priest, intimated that his priesthood was to be entirely distinct from that of Levi's house, and of another order altogether. It was not necessary that he should be of the Levitical order. It was expressly foretold that he was to be of the order of Melchizedek. 4. But even this does not satisfy the apostle, or exhaust the meaning of that marvellous oath of God on which he is authoritatively commenting. It is not enough to make out that it establishes, against all objections that might be taken to it, the unquestionable reality and validity of Christ's priesthood, as having undoubted divine sanction. It does that, but it does a great deal more. It opens up a glorious spiritual view of the nature of his priesthood, and it suggests various particulars in respect of which his priesthood, being the one only messianic priesthood, is preeminent in itself and fruitful of all rich and heavenly blessings to his believing people. Thus, in the first place, it is a royal priesthood, which that of Aaron's house and of the Levitical order was not, and could not be. Christ is, quote, "a priest upon his throne," end quote. Zechariah chapter 6, verse 13. And as his priesthood effectually establishes, quote, "the counsel of peace," end quote, between God and man, so his kingdom is a kingdom of righteousness and peace. Psalm 72. Again, secondly, as a priest, he has no pedigree or genealogy. He has none going before or coming after him in the priestly office. He is alone in his priesthood during all its time. He continueth a priest forever. Then, in the third place, the order of his priesthood is prior in point of date, and superior in point of dignity to that of Aaron's or Levi's priesthood. For when Levi, in the person of his ancestor Abraham, paid tithes to Melchizedek and received his blessing, he virtually acknowledged a higher priesthood than his own. And, fourthly, this acknowledgment of another priesthood, of a different order, proved to be superior by the double test of blessing accepted and tithes given, evidently implies a certain imperfection in the Levitical priesthood, and therefore in the dispensation with which it was connected. The Levitical priesthood was not intended to be perpetual and permanent. It served a temporary purpose until that other priest of another order should arise. From all this it follows that when the other priest of another order has come, his priesthood supersedes all that went before it, and being in the hands of one who continueth ever, and being ratified, moreover, by the divine oath, it cannot be changed. The Levitical priesthood was held by a succession of mortal men, infirm and liable to death, and it was instituted without the solemnity of an oath. This last circumstance indicated the character of the economy to which that priesthood belonged, as being of the nature of a provisional, or, as it were, parenthetical arrangement. It was not confirmed by an appeal to the two immutable things, the divine word and the divine nature, which enter into the idea of the divine oath. In other words, the Levitical dispensation and its priesthood did not form an essential part of that plan or system to which the honour of God is committed, and with which his glory is inseparably blended and identified, which, therefore, must be as irrevocably unchangeable as God himself is. The Levitical law was given, and the Levitical order of priests ordained, to serve a temporary purpose, and, accordingly, the formality of an oath was omitted. But the priesthood after the order of Melchizedek enters into the very essence of the everlasting covenant. Hence, quote, not without an oath is Christ made an high priest, end quote. And hence, also, as a high priest, he is the mediator, not of a shadowy and burdensome legal ritual, which was to wax old and vanish away, but of that grace and truth which came by him, and which in him endure for ever. Such, in substance, is the reasoning of the Apostle in the 7th chapter of the Epistle to the Hebrews, and such is the exalted view which he gives of the priesthood of Melchizedek, as distinct from that of Levi, and identical in its order with that of Christ. Such is the high priest, suited to the necessity of man's case, one who is not only touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but able also, quote, to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him, seeing he ever liveth to make intercession for them, end quote. Verse 25. In the person of Melchizedek, therefore, let us hail a present Saviour, and in what passed between him and our father Abraham, let us recognize the reality and fullness of his ministry of love toward us, receiving in him and through his mediation the blessing of, quote, the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, end quote, we are filled with all the fullness of God. Quote, all things are ours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas, or the world or life or death or things present or things to come, all are ours, end quote. Then, again, in Christ, having, quote, redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins, according to the riches of the free grace of God, end quote, we are appointed to be, quote, to the praise of his glory, end quote. In us, and on our behalf, Christ glorifies the Father. Our escape from guilt, and our consequent victory over all our enemies, form the theme of the new song of praise. With the whole multitude of the redeemed, we ascribe salvation to our God, who sitteth on the throne, and unto the Lamb, and we present the firstfruits of our deliverance, in the dedication of ourselves to the service of God for ever. Quote, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto him, which is your reasonable service. End quote. Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Quote, by him also let us offer the sacrifice of praise to God continually, that is, the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. And to do good and to communicate let us forget not, since with such sacrifices God is well pleased. End quote. Hebrews chapter 13, verses 15 and 16.